Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Net Zero. And what we're going to be talking about is how net zero can be achieved, but also in terms of how it will lead to actual cost savings. My name is Paul Ward, and together with Alex and David from PECT, we're hosting the event. And today we have a group of panelists from the Allerton Project, Alistair. We've got Claire Mike from LEAF, Beth Metzen from the Soil Association Exchange, and then to talk a bit about the financial side of net zero, James Milne from the Barclays Agriculture team is joining us. And then we will have Trina Britton from FSR Farms, Andrew Jackson from S. Jackson and Sons, and finally John Turner from from Turners of Bytham. I'm very grateful to all our panelists for today's input, and I promise you this is a no jargon discussion. It's a very basic run through what carbon neutrality means and also how we get there. So without further ado, I will ask David Knight from PECT to join us and to run through the basics of what net zero means.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's sessions. My name is David Knight. I'm the principal consultant for PECT, working with Business Lincolnshire to essentially talk net zero with organisations. My job for the next 15 minutes is to take us through the net zero agenda, and really just to sort of hopefully just, I guess, simplify the process as to what it actually is and how it can be applied to an organisation. So the reason we're here today is to talk net zero, and simply the definition that's been put into is to achieve reaching net zero emissions. The activities within the value chain result in no net impact on the climate, and this is achieved by reducing emissions and then balancing any remaining emissions through carbon removals. Basically, what we're saying is that the idea of net zero is to understand our own carbon emissions and to reduce them as much as possible. The value chain part has been introduced for us to start to think about the organizations we work with and the emissions that are associated with us doing business activity. What we're going to do today is just sort of go through what this means and what this looks like and how it can start to be applied in a really simple format, and hopefully take out the fear and worry around net zero. So in terms of what actually net zero is, I mean, the ideal is that we want to get to a point where we have no carbon emissions, but let's be fair, technology just doesn't exist for us to do that, and we're so heavily reliant on fossil fuels that it's just not possible for us to achieve this. So the idea then is that we want to look at how we can get as close to zero as possible, and the net element is about effectively capturing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it long term. It is a long-term process. And I always say to organizations, net zero is a 2050 ambition. You know, it's 26, 25 years really from now. Don't get me wrong, that will come certainly quickly. But the idea is that we want to look at what our emissions are and reduce them as much as possible. And then when the time is right, look at what's available for us to actually start to capture carbon. And that could be through a variety of sources. Obviously with yourselves in the agricultural sector, a lot of what you'll be doing, when it comes to sort of planting, etc., plant growth, tree growth, etc., that will be effectively a way to sort of capture carbon. Now, the slide itself is really just to sort of talk about why is net zero so important. The initial element to it is it now is legally required within the UK to achieve net zero by 2050. And we're starting to see more and more requirements for organizations to start to effectively report against this. So a couple of set of programs we're seeing at the moment. The first is referred to as the ESOS, or Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. It's a 4-year program that requires organizations to report, large organizations, to report their energy every 4 years and to have an audit undertaken. This is effectively in the next sort of iteration, which will be in 2027. This will actually start to include net zero. And there's already conversations about actually starting to send this out to smaller organizations, also say larger SMEs. So we are already starting to see a change in the way in which the UK government is requiring organizations to report against this. We also see under the procurement policy note of 0621, so any organization that has effectively wants to tender with central government or even the NHS are now required to produce carbon reduction plans. So again, we're starting to see more and more conversation around this, where the requirement for organizations to start to report under net zero are increasing. Now, the fundamental reasons for this is because climate change is likely to impact all of us, both in terms of infrastructure, but also pressure on supply chains. From the previous slide, we start to see the requirements of organizations needing to report. If you are within a supply chain, your clients and customers are going to need to start reporting under these schemes, which means they're going to start asking you to report to them. So we're already starting to see pressures being pushed through the value chain. Lots of organizations we work with effectively are coming to speak to us about net zero because of this very reason, and likely maybe some of you on the call today are feeling the same sort of pressures as well. The sort of concept to it in terms of looking at net zero is the sooner you can start, the easier it becomes. And again, over the next few slides, we'll just start to talk about what that can kind of look like for you. As Paul mentioned at the beginning of it, if we can start to reduce our carbon emissions, it can lead to financial benefits. But what it would certainly do is it will actually start to make you more attractive to investors. For any organization that's looking to, access finance, we're starting to see this conversation in the sort of finance sphere, where they're starting to look at organizations and their work towards net zero, but certainly towards climate awareness and climate risk. The main thing is that, look, it's going to happen. So really start to get ahead while you can, start to look at this while there's funding and support available for you to really start supporting you in terms of achieving the net zero. So the slide itself is just really around, sort of the climate science that sits behind all of this. So the Paris Climate Agreement, which was set in 2015, looked at the impacts of carbon emissions and what that's likely to do to temperature rise. Now, we were already seeing year after year the impacts of climate change on the weather systems and how much of an impact that has on us. The real challenge is as the planet gets warmer, the risks to climate change are only going to increase. So what we want to do is we want to try and achieve a minimization to global temperature rise to around about 1.5, but certainly well below 2 degrees. Now, the best way for us to do that is to actually halve our emissions every 10 years. So if you just click through the slide, you'll see, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Perfect. Thank you. So as we can see here, between effectively by 2030, the idea is that we need to try and get our emissions as close to 50% reduction as we possibly can. And then every decade from that, halve those emissions again. The reality is that the quicker we can actually decarbonize and really push our emissions down, the easier it becomes in the latter period. If we don't start to hit this sort of reduction by 2030, we can still make reductions, but it does just become a little bit harder to try and hit those sort of minimal global temperatures. So a lot of the work that's being done around at the moment with net zero is really about just getting to understand your organization's impact and reduce them as quickly as possible, and again, as best as you can, to try and get towards the sort of 50% reduction by 2030, 2035. And looking to get to as close as possible to around about 70 to 90% reduction by 2050, at which point then obviously looking to balance the residual emissions using carbon removal, so taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So when we talk about decarbonisation, what do we actually mean? So effectively what we're looking to do is to look at the energy sources that we have and to try and find, move away from non-renewable energy sources to lower carbon impact sources. So when we start to look at our decarbonisation plans, it's really as simple as calculate your carbon footprint, the emissions that you generate as an organisation. Identify your hotspots. So what is the priority for you? Which parts of your energy do you use the most? Which parts of your business contributes the most in terms of carbon emissions? Identify what they are and start to think about ways in which you can start to reduce those. The key to this is not to tackle everything in one go, but really to start to think about what are the big ticket items available to you that can start to make reductions straight away. And then start to think about what that looks like in terms of what reductions you can make and how long you need to think about in terms of making changes to your organization. So in terms of jargon, one thing always to be aware of is that when we talk about carbon emissions, we refer to the allocation of who's responsible, and we use the term scopes. So you'll hear this a lot whenever net zero is talked about: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Essentially, it's a designation of responsibility. So scope 1 and scope 2 are energy that you are responsible for, or so we say carbon emissions that you are responsible for. Now, the way it works is scope 1 is any emissions that you have direct control and ownership of. So any equipment that you have that uses fuel, that burns fuel, and the emissions released from that, so boilers, furnaces, whatever that looks like, that effectively is your direct responsibility. Any vehicles you have, and again, fuels that are burned in those vehicles where you directly control and own those vehicles, that's part of your scope 1 as well. Fugitive emissions. Now, we refer to as F gases, which are effectively refrigerants, but here we're also talking about gases that are released from your fertilizer. So when you fertilize the field and nitrous oxides released from that, those are effectively part of your scope 1 emissions because you're directly in control of those emissions, and then any process emissions as well. Scope 2 is unique in the sense of it's about purchased energy. So here we're specifically talking about electricity. Again, you're not responsible for the generation of the electricity, but you are directly responsible for how you use electricity across your sites. So scope 2 is unique because it's not quite a direct emission source, but you have got a direct control over how you use it. So for any organization thinking about yourself directly, scope 1 and 2 is effectively any energy or any fuels that you use in order to deliver your activity where you have direct control and ownership over the equipment that uses them. Now, what that then means is scope 3 is pretty much everything else. Now, this is, shall we say, the unique part of net zero, and what was introduced at net zero is the value chain approach. Effectively now that organizations can't just focus on just themselves, they do need to start to think about the types of materials they use, the type of organizations they work with, the way in which you as an organization, operates, and how your activity can lead to carbon emissions happening elsewhere. So whilst you don't have direct control and ownership of the emissions, you are indirectly responsible for them. So effectively, scope 3 is a measure of your influence. How can you start to influence others to start to think about their carbon emissions? So this is a sort of a picture that kind of helps to demonstrate that. So again, you as the individual company, organization, you control your scope 1 and 2. That's what you directly report for yourself. And then anything that you essentially buy into your organization is your upstream activity as part of your scope 3. And anything that leaves your organization is effectively your downstream activity, again, part of that value chain approach. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time focusing on that. We'll do a little bit on it, but really we're just going to focus on the key, which is scope 1 and 2 emissions. So in terms of where I can get that information from, whenever you start to calculate your carbon emissions, the idea is basically to think about all the different fuels and resources you use as an organization that you have control over and start to measure that. So a lot of you are already doing this as part of various accreditations you may be part of, but effectively you're looking at any fuels, natural gas, any sort of oil, LPG, petrol, diesel for your vehicles, maybe even sort of mileage for any sort of business vehicles that you have. Again, F-gas, if you happen to have any refrigerants, heat pumps, air conditioning systems, or any sort of large refrigerator plant, they have a refrigerant goes in them, and you get service notes from your servicing organization, which tells you the impact of those equipments and machines. Also get a measure of your electricity as well. So again, you can get these from your meters, which is the most accurate way, but also utility bills if that's an easier way for you to get the information. When it comes to scope 3, really at this stage, the idea is just to start to understand what that looks like for yourself. So what are the goods and services that you're buying in as an organization? What kind of equipment do you use and are you buying in? Thinking about your logistics. So are you bringing in equipment and how is that being transported from your customer to your organization? Also thinking about if you are selling any products and services, how are they being transported to the retailers? What does that look like? Start to think about any waste that you're producing and how that can be managed better, as well as any sort of commuting that may happen within the organization as well. So in terms of calculating your emissions, effectively what we do is we take the activity or data, so the total amount of those fuels and resources that you've used over the year, you multiply them by an emissions factor, and that allows you to calculate your carbon footprint or your greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the UK provides emissions factors free of charge. There's also a whole range of online calculators, as I'm sure will come up in today's conversation, that you can use to actually calculate your emissions. Now, in terms of strategy, the one thing I always try to sort of, understand is whenever I'm talking to organizations about this is, 2050 is still 25 years away. So it's a long term in terms of what we need to get to from today to 2050. In terms of the strategy, really what the whole sort of concept of net zero is, it is about long-term planning now. So we're kind of used to working in 3 to 5 year business plans. Most organizations tend to do that. But we do need to start to think about 25 years time. What does that actually look like for us as an organization? So what does 2050 mean? What does net zero mean to you? What would you have to change to your business to meet your 2050 target. Now, the reason it's important is because if you think about that long-term goal and then you start to build your strategy and plan in terms of how you're going to get there. Now, things will change, technology will improve, various things will come about, regulation will start to come to play as well. So the journey that we take isn't a linear approach. There are going to be adaptations. We might need to change things. There might be, various things that will come in the way. So what I always say to organizations is to break your plan down into 5 years, as we used to, 3 to 5 year planning, but working towards an end goal by 2050. So what does that look like? That's the direction of travel. And then how you get there, you basically break down into sort of manageable milestones. I always say that it's easier to talk in 5 year periods than it is necessary to talk in annual periods, because anything can change year to year. So what we want to do is we want to measure our change over time. So doing it over a 5 year period allows us to actually, effectively, track against trends. Are we going in the right direction? Yes, there might be the odd year that's a bit higher in emissions than some years, depending on business activity. But as long as we're showing the reductions over time, that's really what we're looking to achieve. So when you start to think about your strategy, I find the best way of doing it is just to break it down into what is your organization. So thinking about your buildings, what is the energy requirement for your buildings? Variety of different buildings that you can use and the need for them. So effectively, how are your buildings operating? What energy are you using within them? And just think about what changes do you need to make within your buildings to start to, minimize your carbon emissions. Now, as I said before, the reality is we're trying to move away from non-renewable fossil fuels, basically. So shifting away from fossil fuels to electricity or low carbon sources, whatever that happens to look like. That's really the aim of the game that we're trying to achieve. So thinking about our buildings, what energy do we currently use? Now, in terms of making changes to this, some of the key things to think about is your building should really use energy when they're effectively in operation. So whenever your building isn't in operation, what does its shutdown look like? How well do you sort of manage that building in terms of the energy that you're using? So key savings are achieved through reducing running hours and then infrastructural technology improvements. The other side of it is then start to think about processes. So what processes do you have within your organization? So what do they look like? How is energy used within them? Again, here we're looking to achieve savings through optimization. So making those processes more efficient, maybe material selection and technology improvements. And then finally, to start to think about transport. Again, here we're trying to eliminate transport where we can. But certainly look to optimize. So how efficient are your vehicles? How efficient are you using your vehicles in terms of minimizing the amount of fuel? And then also what kind of vehicles could you be using that might look at low carbon alternatives to fossil fuels? So when you start to think about decarbonization, start to think about it in a way of any sort of hierarchy. So what can I eliminate across my life cycle? So what parts of the emissions can I just simply remove entirely? Now that might become down to business development. It might come to maybe altered operation or new products or services. Anything I can't eliminate, I then want to reduce or substitute. So obviously reduction through optimization. Can I just become more efficient in using the materials that I am using, or can I substitute them for something else? So again, moving from fossil fuels to electricity as an example. And then finally, the last point is to then think about compensation, which is about actually then carbon removal. So what is that going to look like for you as an organization, and how are you going to start to invest in that? So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on scope 3 now. Whenever I show this slide, it's really sort of worrying in terms of, oh my God, that's everything that we need to look to under scope 3. The reality is not all of that will be applicable to you. There will only be certain elements that are. The main focus really for any organization when starting to look at net zero is just to get to understand yourself first and then worry about scope 3 in time. As I said, we want to hit that 50% reduction by 2030. Once we've achieved that, then we can start to really focus on what our scope 3 looks like in terms of the organizations we're working with. So just to sort of wrap up really, in terms of what you should do, first of all, understand your energy and resource consumption for you as an organization. What is it you're using? Why are you using it? How are you using it? And what are the opportunities to start to improve? Set yourself a baseline. So you want 12 months of good, accurate data. Set the baseline. And as I mentioned, we're measuring our performance over time. So once we've set our baseline, we're basically comparing ourselves against that over 5-year milestones, aiming towards a net zero goal by 2050. Really start simple. So what uses the most energy? Prioritize your hotspots. Focus on the bits that you can change as quickly as possible. Other things can wait and will take time to sort of develop. But really sort of, rather than trying to fight every fire, just fight the biggest ones and try to manage those as best you can. Now, I always refer to as a sort of action plan or roadmap as a narrative. What is your narrative? What are you doing as an organization that's minimizing your carbon emissions? What does 2050 look like and how are you getting there? That's really what the roadmap or action plan is. It's your narration in terms of what you are doing as an organization to reduce your carbon emissions. As I mentioned, set 5-yearly milestones or timeframes in terms of comparing your performance against, and then really start to consider your scope 3 just from an initial phase in terms of who are you working with, what kind of materials are you buying in, and where you can start to make improvements in that. The last slide for me then, just in terms of things to consider, your scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 and 2. So the fundamental part, I would always say to organizations, really focus on your scope 1 and 2, because that's what you can control and manage. The reason why the value chain approach to net zero is there is because actually what they want you to do is to start to speak to your suppliers or anyone within your value chain to say, well, actually, what are you doing around carbon emissions? If you can encourage others to start to focus on their scope 1 and 2 and bring down their emissions, your scope 3 will naturally come down as well. So most of it is just about communication and encouraging others to do the same. As long as you focus on your scope 1 and 2 and reduce that and start to ask others to do the same, that's effectively the net zero journey. So scope 3 doesn't need to be as scary as many people believe it to be. It is just about actually just encouraging people to focus on their scope 1 and 2. And then together, if everyone does the same, achieves the reductions they need to within their scope 1 and 2, this will naturally happen anyway. So part of your strategy will require others to decarbonize. When we're talking about decarbonisation, as I mentioned, we're trying to move away from non-renewable energy sources. So we're looking to move away from fossil fuels to low carbon alternatives. Now, that might be electricity. The key thing is that electricity will decarbonise over time. So whilst you may increase the amount of electricity used as you move from fossil fuels, your decarbonisation strategy to electricity is based upon the grid decarbonising itself, which is a goal for the UK government. So the grid itself will decarbonise over time. You haven't got to worry about that. Your role is really just to focus on what are the non-renewable energy sources and how can I minimise those as much as possible to move to things like electricity or low carbon sources, which will decarbonise over time. One of the things I always find sometimes a bit difficult is because we do talk about reductions, we have to also understand that there's a limit to how far we can reduce. So really what we need to understand is what is your optimal performance? What is the minimum amount that you need to use in order to still exist as an organization? You can't reduce completely. Decarbonization is about moving away from non-renewable energy sources, not strictly about just purely reducing the amount of energy you're using. Yes, there's efficiencies that you can gain, and yes, there's opportunities in that. But really what we want to get to is what is your optimal performance and how can I achieve that? The most important thing is when your clients are asking you about your carbon emissions, what they really just want to know is, are you managing things well? So that's it. So as long as you build an action plan which shows that you've at least looked at it and are considering things and are decarbonizing the best you can, that's actually enough to satisfy them. Confidence forms when you manage things well. So as long as you can show people you're managing things, that's it. That's all that you really need to achieve. And when it comes to sort of costs around net zero, again, I always try to talk from, rather than thinking about the cost of net zero, think about the value. What is the value in decarbonising versus the cost of to do so? If we can start to apply a value frame to it, it becomes an easier process for us to start to, grapple with, really. And that's it from me. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back to Paul.
Thank you, David. That was a very good a simple explanation of what net zero is about. I'm now going to just run through from an agricultural sector point of view. Now, the first thing I want to point out is if you have any questions on the discussions that are taking place today, can you just please put them in the chat? Alex will pick them up and then she'll ask them of the appropriate person at the end of the panel discussion. I'm just going to briefly talk about my own experience as somebody who's embedded in agriculture of what net zero is all about. I suppose if I go back to 2000 and 2006, I was involved in South Africa as an agronomist and technologist on fruit tree crops, and we were working with one of the big retailers supplying into the UK. And the problem came loud and clear when World Wildlife Fund first said to us in 2006, guys, you're draining the Dorans River Valley. And we all looked at each other and went, no, we're not. That's 200 kilometres away. The truth of the matter is we were actually using groundwater that was coming from the riverbed of the Dorans River, and we were draining it 200 kilometres away. Now, if you think about what we're actually doing, and why is net zero all important? If we're importing 400,000 tonnes of apples and pears a year, we are effectively importing about 330,000 tons of water a year. That's water that's never going to go back to countries where water is a scarce resource anyway. If we look at some of the countries I've been involved with, if we start in Spain, for example, I remember a crop of peaches and nectarines that were grown under cover. They were the earliest in the world in the Northern Hemisphere. Within 12 years, Morocco, which at the start of the 12-year period could not produce stone fruit, was quite happily doing it, and not only quite happily doing it, but it was actually earlier than Spain. If we look at Kenya at the minute, they've had extreme heat and drought, they've had extreme flooding, they've gone to cold periods, and now they're back in flooding again. If you look at Nigeria, we've got plus 50 Celsius out there at the minute, and we only have to look at Spain and see the severe flooding that has happened in Valencia recently. So this is a reality. And if we look at the whole situation, the Future Fens Integrated Adoption Group recently published a report with the University of East Anglia, commissioned by Tyndall Centre for Climate Change. And it basically says in our area, the highlights will be rising temperatures, intensified flooding, severe droughts, biodiversity loss, and drastic disruptions to agriculture. So unfortunately, you know, it is a reality and we need to address it. My view is we've got about 26 years till 2050. And if we're not 75% self-sufficient by then, we have a problem. You know, we're going to see different crops being grown. We're already growing grapes. We'll see things like passion fruit and honeyberries being grown. Who knows what else? So my journey on net zero started in about 2006, but it wasn't until about 2019 when I was actually asked to work out a carbon footprint. And I'd heard of a cool farm tool, you know, back in the noughties, but never really used it. And it wasn't until the last 5 or 6 years that I had to start using it. Now, it's very daunting for anybody when you suddenly go out there and you start to have to do things. But as David said, it's all about the low-hanging branches. As farmers, the biggest things will be fuels, diesel, white diesel, you know, heating fuel, etc., electricity, water, and things like fertilizer. Now, you don't necessarily need to. What I started to do when I first started doing this, I'd start to go into the nth degree, and you soon realize that you're just digging yourself a hole. Start basic, start with one crop that you know is a big energy user, for example. Start and look at, you'll have the data. It's a question of analysing what figures you've got and using it as best you can. You won't get it right to start with, and I certainly didn't. I was putting scope 3 emissions in with my scope 1 and 2. Soon realised that, but you learn as you go. The other thing to point out is as you get better at it, you will start to gather more data and you will start to see things. And there are tools out there. In my own case, I started using the Leaf energy audit tool. Very simple to use. You gather your diesel energy use, your white diesel, any heating fuels, and your electricity. And very quickly, you can start to see what your carbon figure is looking like. Over time, as you get better, you will.
We've done something.
You're in, Andrew. So over time, you will actually start to see that you're getting better at it. But start simple. Start with one crop. And as you get better and as you learn from your mistakes, you will then be able to do more and more. You know, it will probably take you 3 to 5 years really to start to build a proper approach to it. But as Andrew said, as David said rather, start with what the big wins are, have a plan, and use tools such as the Cool Farm tool and the other tools that are out there. Now, one thing that I want to say is, why do we talk about saving money as part of net zero, one of the things we found was that we started to analyze costs. We looked at electricity. We're using mercury halide bulbs. Hang on a minute, we could be using the other types of bulbs that are much more energy efficient. We started looking at the fertilizer applications were whole field. By changing the fertilizer spreader, we were able to optimize fertilizer use, get better yields, better size, bigger fruit. So, you know, what you'll actually find is you'll start to interrogate the data that you have. What also starts to happen is you start to look at why you're doing certain things. And one of the things we started to look at was why haven't we got a soil management plan? It's one of the key things in farming, and yet we haven't got a plan for it. So there are things on the SFI out there that will allow you to do soil health and nutrient management plan. You get paid to do it, you might as well do it, but it will actually help you towards net zero. Net zero is not a desktop exercise for farmers to do. It is part of the day-to-day life. So everything you do as a farmer, it's the one industry where we can influence carbon more than anybody else. Why? Because we can sequester carbon. And one of the speakers who comes later will actually show that they've, well, two of them actually will be able to show that they've reduced their carbon footprint dramatically. So from a personal point of view, I've looked at what I'm doing, you know, and electric cars are an option for me. As somebody who goes around advising, it makes sense to use an electric car in the area because I don't have to go too far. But I'm looking at other things. You know, going back to this, 2050 is not a long way away. Don't get caught up in the jargon of what net zero is or isn't. Look at the easy wins that you've got. Your energy. If you've got a coal store, is it sub-metered? If it isn't, why isn't it? There could be a compressor in that unit that is not running efficiently, that's using more energy than it should do. All this is going to drive cost savings. But at the same time, it's going to get you nearer to net zero. Now, we've got Barclays involved today because obviously from a finance point of view, it's important that people start to go down the net zero route. Finance houses will be looking for people to do things that are more green. And also, those that are involved with retail will know that you have to do things like manufacture 2030. So it's really important that you take this journey and you really do move forward. It's part of the business strategy. I would strongly recommend it because essentially what it's doing is it's driving efficiency. It's not just about getting to net zero. It is, but it's also about driving efficiency. Now, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to move on to our first panelist, Dr. Alistair Leake. I'm going to ask Alistair to give 5 minutes about who he is and what he does. And then I'll move through each of the panelists and do the same, and then I'll open up with the questions. So over to Alistair.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, and good morning, everybody. My name's Alistair Leake. I look after the Allerton project, which is an 800-acre research and demonstration farm here in East Leicestershire. The farm is probably most famous for our wildlife and biodiversity. In fact, we doubled our songbird numbers in just 3 years when we took over in 1993. So our focus really up to this very day has been biodiversity, but we, like everybody else, have had to look at how we manage our carbon. And for me, this isn't a particularly complicated thing to do. I basically have two sets of carbon accounts. The first set is the emissions that are involved in the crops that we grow on the farm, which are principally arable crops. And the second set of accounts is what I call the sequestration accounts. In other words, the carbon that we lock up in what I call the ecological infrastructure of the farm, which is the grassland, the woodlands, the hedgerows, the field margins, and all that. And that is basically how my accounts work. So if we look at crop production, for example, my two main emissions are from soil cultivations and from nitrogen fertilizer. So by moving away from a plough-based tillage system to a reduced till system, we have cut our fuel usage by 50%. And that, incidentally, has doubled our work rate, which is proving extremely useful as we the battle with the climate change we've already got, with tighter drilling windows, particularly in the autumn. Nitrogen use efficiency, well, I believe that in this country, on average, we're about 60% nitrogen efficient. So obviously, there's quite a lot we can do there. Two things that we're doing in particular is using a nitrogen calculation plan, which we put quite a lot of data in, which allows us to target the nitrogen rate to the expected crop output. And a recent addition is the growing of legume lays, AB15 under environmental stewardship, which fixes nitrogen and means that the first wheat after the lay period needs very little fertiliser putting on. Then to my second set of counts, the ecological infrastructure. I think the biggest stride we've made here is the creation of the first hedgerow carbon code. This was done with a Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund grant from the Environment Agency, and we now have a very simple but effective calculator which allows me to put the height, the width and the length of the hedge into the calculator, and that then gives me a carbon figure for that. We've also done the same thing for beetle banks. Beetle banks are quite good at locking up carbon, and this is allowing me to get a better idea of what I'm actually sequestering on the farm as well. And finally, to go back to a point that David made, if we can reduce our emissions, we can reduce our costs as well. And in 2012, I built a new training centre, visitor centre here, and we chose to do this using low carbon materials. So it's a straw bale build with sheep's wool in the roof, biomass underfloor heating system, photovoltaics for the electricity, a rainwater harvesting system so that the water used to flush the toilets comes from our own roof and is not pumped up hill using electricity. And whilst this was quite a challenge to build at the time, I'm really feeling the benefits now in terms of cost savings, because we chip our own coppiced hedgerow to produce the biomass. The insulation keeps the building really warm in winter, but keeps it cool in summertime. The electricity is generated ourselves. In fact, my next plan is to put a battery system in, so I'm able to use that solar power more effectively. And all of those measures that I've taken, we have now paid the capital cost off, and are reaping the benefits of lower running costs. So I can recommend that as something to look at. That's me. Thank you. I think that's probably at least my 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. I'll move on to Claire, Mike, if I may, and introduce what Claire does and Leaf.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for having me. So my name's Claire Mike. I'm Director of Technical and Business Development here at Leaf. I joined 6 years ago as Director of Business Development, and we've gone through significant growth since then, and have since taken on the technical function too. So within that, have oversight for our Leaf Mark certification system, and also the work, the very valuable work that Leaf delivers in knowledge exchange and our Leaf network of demonstration farms and innovation centres. Like I said, I've been at Leaf for 6 years, but prior to that have spent around 20 years in the food supply chain, working predominantly in produce, in sourcing. So actually I've had the huge privilege of getting to travel the world, and actually witness and see for myself how farmers and growers, both here in the UK and around the world, are tackling things like carbon, etc., within that integrated farm management network. I'll tell you a little bit about Leaf. We are a charity, a membership-based charity that promotes and supports more sustainable farming to create a resilient food and farming system for future generations. And we do this through connecting, through building trust, and through educating. We connect people through enabling that knowledge exchange, through our network of demonstration farms and our innovation centres, through the research and the projects that we participate in, through the training that we provide, and through the events that we host, and the resources that we publish as well. We build trust predominantly through the LEAF Mark certification system, and have global experience of that, of how you make an assurance system work like LEAF Mark, and those environmental metrics and measures, and how you enable those practices to be for the participation, the demonstration of those practices, and outcomes. And we educate and connect through young people, educators and farmers, engaging them with the food that we eat, enabling and inspiring more sustainable consumers, and very importantly, attracting new talent into our industry. At Leaf, we promote an integrated farm management approach, which allows for the uniqueness of each and every farm business, adopting the best of modern technology with traditional methods too. Integrated farm management encourages you to put that environmental mindset at the heart of your farming business. We help to provide the evidence-based research which can help inspire and support decision making, and we identify positive environmental indicators which through LEAF Mark can be measured, managed and assured. And also that integrated farm management mindset also is based around that continuous improvement, so marginal gains in terms of modifications and new practices and new outcomes that you can be measuring on your farm. Equally, we understand that a resilient food and farming system depends on building farmer knowledge, and providing exchange opportunities and forums for discussion. We promote farmer welfare. We know that there are a great many farmers that are feeling the weight of change and transition within the industry, and we have to support them and their legacy, and to protect our national food security too. And we want to promote healthy, holistic food systems that are not just healthy for the environment, but also healthy for people, healthy for the economy, healthy for the planet. So in partnership with retailers, brands, banks, researchers, other NGOs, and a great many others, we seek to discover and implement and support solutions that enable more resilient food systems.
Okay. Thank you, Claire. I will be very grateful for that. I'll move on to Beth from the Soil Association Exchange, if she can just give us a quick rundown of who she is and what the Soil Exchange does, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. Shout if you can't. I'm Beth Metzen. I work at the Soil Association Exchange and have done for around 18 months. I work as head of agricultural advice, have the privilege of leading a team of 23 farm advisors all roaming the UK, helping farmers individually to baseline ecological metrics across the farm. I have worked in the industry for nearly 20 years, always doing environmental advice. I've had the privilege of working with lots of different farms, spent a lot of time in Lincolnshire as well, which is always great. And yeah, worked very much with conventional farms in the past, and now work for the Soil Association Exchange, which you might gather has a connection with the Soil Association, and often very much associated with organic farming. But I just want to clear that one up, that yes, the Soil Association do have a certification arm, and yes, that is all around organic farming, but the Soil Association is much broader than that and has a much broader reach. There is also the charity arm in the Soil Association, which helps numerous enterprises and walks and different types of farming. So there's the famous innovative farmers approach, which is all about helping farmers to research on their own farms and try out different techniques and strategies, a lot of what we're talking about today. And yeah, so that's the Soil Association. The Soil Association Exchange is a service for all farmers. We've seen over 1,000 farmers now, all about measuring carbon, soils, biodiversity, community and society, as well as biodiversity and animal welfare. We collect around 40 metrics, trying to give that holistic feel for farms. On the ground, primary data being collected on farm, on the ground people, both giving advice, but also collecting this primary data alongside the farmers out there that we're seeing. Off the back of that, we give advice and we make recommendations and help that farmer to build a strategy to limit those trade-offs that often come when you're aiming for something like net zero. So we want to try and limit those trade-offs when it comes to biodiversity and animal welfare. So looking at all those different things rather than just this siloed approach, perhaps sometimes we might get ourselves into. Yeah, shall I stop there to give us a bit more time?
That's great. Thank you,
Okay.
Beth. Okay, we will now move on to Barclays and James Milne. James is the head of the East Midlands and Southeastern, isn't it? Agricultural sector lead. So I'll hand over to you, James.
Well, yeah, good morning, everybody. So yeah, James Milne, Regional Head of Barclays Agriculture. Yeah, I cover Central and Southeast part of the UK. I directly lead sort of 12 relationship directors across that part of the country, and there's 80 colleagues in all that work within Barclays Agriculture. We support within our teams around about 14,000 farmers. We have got more farming clients than that across the whole of Barclays, but in different teams. I'll cover it in a moment, just a bit of an update around Barclays as a whole in our journey towards net zero, just to give you a bit of an overview. I think specifically within farming and agriculture, though, which is where I work in Barclays, and obviously what we're discussing today, we do bank 1 in 5 farmers across the UK, and for every £4 that is lent to the sector, 1 of those pounds has come from Barclays. So we're really proud of that sort of market position. Really understand that actually there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of competition, rightly so. So we need to work hard to be agile and sort of move and become relevant for our farming customers. And a big part of being relevant is this is the green sustainability agenda, and I'll talk a bit more about sort of some of the finance in a moment, which we'll come on to. I know some of the questions will be around there. But back in March 2020, we were one of the first banks to announce our ambition to be sort of net zero by 2050. We've got 3 parts to that strategy. This is Barclays Group as a whole. It comes under the name of Blue Track, so it's 292 pages, I think. So if you really like a bit of bedtime reading, then I recommend you go and have a look. But to summarise it in 60 seconds, we've got 3 parts: achieving net zero operation. So as David's already spoken about, sort of the scope 1, 2, and 3. This would really be our scope 1. So actually, how can Barclays get the real estate that we operate in? How can we make sure that the fleet of cars that we use and anything that we can control, how can we reduce the operational emissions attached to that? Next, and probably relevant for today, is how do we reduce our financed emissions? And I'm trying to keep the jargon down here, but basically what the financed emissions will be, there'll be a moment in time for all sectors where we need to measure the emissions to every pound that we lend. So let's take a basic example. January the 1st, we give you £1 of money to borrow. We will measure the emissions for that pound attached to the customer, and then we'll remeasure it in a year's time. And hopefully over time, those emissions will reduce, and that's because we're working with you as the customer. Obviously, then we scale that up. Some sectors are much greater emitters than others. So within Barclays, we've started to identify those sectors to really help the customers within there to hopefully bridge the gap long term. And agriculture is, I think it's the third highest sector that, from a financed emissions perspective, behind power and transportation. So it's the third highest there. So clearly we need to address it and work with our customers. And the last part is the financing the transition. So actually, how can we, as a Barclays, as a bank, how can we use our finance to support that transition? And we've certainly seen that in sort of some of the larger emitting sort of sectors, oil, gas, etc., where we've really been able to utilise that, and where we want to put the sort of £1 trillion of sustainable finance into that market. So there's sort of the three main areas, and obviously I can touch a bit more in the specifics around agriculture and what it means for farmers on the ground later on. But that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That's brilliant. And now we'll go on to Trina from FSR Farms. If you can introduce yourself, Trina, and what the business does. 5 minutes, please.
Hi, Trina Britton here. So I manage an estate that includes FRS farming. So we've got diversity on the farm around office units, wedding and conference venue, and a village pub as well. So we've got very different elements that come into trying to measure our overall business. But on the farming side, what we found easiest for us to measure and what's important to us has been soil health. I think we have a bit of an anxiety around how we gather data, and they say data is power, and I think it's probably our weakest point is how we gather that data, how we measure things. We farm around 3,000 acres. We do wheat, barley, oats, sugar. We used to do sugar beet. We do potatoes, peas, beans, oilseed rape. We've got a team of 4 that manage the farm. We have started the journey on what some people would label as regen, but again, for our focus, it's all around soil health. That's what's really important to us. So we've included things like we talked before about the AB15 cover crops. Started looking at companion crops. We do a bit of direct drilling, definitely reduced tillage. We've also been looking at variable drilling, so we do quite a bit of that now that we never used to do. So we're on the journey. Everything that we're looking at is around making sure that the farm is in a fit state for future generations, and that's definitely our focus and our culture. And where we sit at the moment, we feel that net zero is an output of our overall strategy rather than our underlying strategy.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Trina. I'll move on to Andrew Jackson. Hopefully you can hear us, Andrew, and you're with us. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Andrew Jackson. I'm a third generation family farm. We've got about 330 hectares in North Lincolnshire on 2 units about 13 miles apart. So I have got green leanings, and probably in 2016, I read a book called Dirt to Soil, which is by a man called Gabe Brown, who's been through quite a big journey himself in life. But I came away thinking that the prescription he'd led, which is essentially the regen farming prescription, was something that I couldn't argue with, and I wanted to try and adapt to our climate and market. We started off with a strip till drill, and after 4 years, we moved on to a direct drill for which we got a grant of 40%. But it's not all about direct drilling. A regen system involves a varied rotation, living roots, soil cover, and introducing livestock if you can. So we've tried to do all those things. And in this journey, we've made a lot of mistakes. But we've actually, if you look on the 12-year period from 2012 to 2024, we've made labour savings of 75%, diesel savings of 58%, repair bill savings 40%. We don't apply phosphate and potash because we believe that could be antagonistic to the soil, so that's 100% saving. Nitrogen savings about 50%. Insecticides we've cut out altogether, so that's 100%, and we've reduced our fungicides costings to about 60% of where we were. So it's been quite a big journey. We have taken some yield penalties, but I'm optimistic that I've taken a yield penalty of about 1.6 tonnes per hectare, but the savings I've made represent all those. They will cover those savings, and I'm optimistic that I will get my yield back. So what we've done so far has been a particularly good fit with the new SFI, which will allow me to match my previous basic farm payments. We've done 3 carbon calculators, and we're carbon neutral, so that will open up new markets in the future. We've joined something called the Environmental Farmers Group, which was set up in Hampshire to trade natural capital, and they've got a framework which allows us, or will encourage us, to trade biodiversity net gain, biodiversity, carbon, and we may get income streams from things such as environmental and social governance and trading carbon, which could be insetting to our supply chain, and we want to do that for a premium rather than it become a condition of supply. I'm currently looking at new markets, one of which I'm engaged with, which is the Wild Farm brand, which was Andy Cato on Clarkson's farm. There's another one called Green Farm Collective, which is paying premiums for the products that I can grow. We're also direct marketing our lamb, which will have sort of a regenerative brand to it. Along this journey, we've been asked to appear in a film, and my daughter's in the 6 inches of soil film, and I also appear. And for further information on learning all about this, there's something called Base UK, which is the Conservation Agriculture Group. There's Groundswell, which is an annual event, and there's something called Direct Driller magazine, which I subscribe to, and it's a free magazine. So I hope that helps everybody.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Andrew, and well done on getting the connection to work. Okay, and finally we'll come to John Turner of Turners of Bytham. Over to you, John.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
So yeah, John Turner, it's a family farm based near Stamford, down in the southwest corner of Lincolnshire. We farm 325 acres. My involvement in the farm sort of started in the 1960s, where we had a small dairy, which we sort of built the herd up over a number of years. We got to about 1998, and with the sort of pressures on dairy, we felt we were pushing the farm harder and harder and harder, and pushing the animals harder and harder, and making less and less money. So at that point, we decided to look at organic conversion, because it basically gave us a market and access to a market that really embraced the values that, it allowed us to return to what we felt was a more natural capacity of farming. So I think that's the point at which I would honestly say I really started to learn farming properly. And we're still on a journey. I think every year that goes by, I feel I know less and less, and it's purely because I'm sort of aware of how much more we need to learn. So from that organic conversion, 2004, at that point, we went in on the strength of a contract that was offered for organic milk, which was meant to be a 3-year sort of rolling contract, gave us the confidence to take the plunge and convert the farm. But by 2004, that organic milk contract had collapsed, and we then moved into beef. And purely by, I suppose, accident, we realised we could finish beef on the grasses that we'd been growing with the dairy. without any other inputs. That sort of led us to help set up the Pasture for Life as a sort of recognised way of raising ruminants purely off grass without cereals. I suppose parallel to this as well, I had some involvement in we worked with NGOs just to try and understand what the challenges were in farming, where we needed to go. That sort of helps. We were involved in helping set up the original Oxford Real Farming Conference, and we've sort of remained part of that, over the years. And that sort of takes us up, I suppose, to the last part of the last 10 years, where we've focused increasingly on soils. And although it's a bit obvious, I think just some of the speakers that we got in through the Oxford Real Farm Conference, and as a number of people have mentioned groundswell, when we've got these sorts of events with experts in soils coming in, it makes us sort of look again at what is our most valuable resource on a farm, which is the soil, and what's going on in the soil, and the effect of what we do in terms of cultivations, inputs, that sort of thing, and how that sort of interacts with the ability of the soil to produce the crops. And that's the area, as I say, that we're learning more and more about. I wish I was sort of 20 years old rather than coming towards the end of my farming career. But alongside the work we're doing with soils, I think measuring, what we do in terms of impact is really important. Farmers tend to be rather time poor, so collecting that data and knowing what to do with it once you've got it has been, I suppose, a challenge. But over the last couple of years, we've taken advantage of DEFRA grants, which have allowed us to bring other people in to actually do that work for us, crunch the numbers, and give us some things we can work at. Particularly through benchmarking, we can identify those areas where a lot more gains can be made. Beth, we use the Soil Association exchange tool, which I think is really useful because it's a three-dimensional thing. It doesn't focus purely on carbon. It's things like the social capital, how many jobs we're providing within the farm. And that really reflects, I think, more to me, farming, that, we've got to be careful when you're just not trading off one problem against another, that holistically we are measuring what we do in terms of our ability to feed people and the social role of farming. So I think that, just to wrap things up very, very quickly, in terms of inputs, we've been mindful to try and decouple ourselves as far as possible from inputs, and we're now completely self-sufficient in terms of energy production. Although we're connected to the grid, the amount we generate on the farm is equal to the amount we consume. We're on a borehole, which I know we're extracting groundwater, but we're not using the infrastructure of the main system for that, and we spend quite a lot of time closely monitoring our water use on the farm. Fuel is still a slight issue, and plastics is the other big issue for us on the farm. We do a lot of wrapped bale silage for trading, and unfortunately we are still using a lot of plastic. So some of the solutions are going to come from outside of our farm, but where those solutions exist, we try and keep our ears open and embrace change as it comes along. So yeah, that's about where we are. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, John. And okay, now what we're going to do now is I'm going to talk to each of the panelists in turn, and I've got a few questions that I'm going to pose to them. And I will start with Dr. Alistair from the Allerton Project. I suppose my first question is, biodiversity is a really important part of farm life, but how does biodiversity fit with the whole sort of carbon agenda? I know it's important, but can you simply put that into speak that explains why farmers should also be looking at biodiversity? I'm thinking about diversity in the soil as much as in the trees and in the hedgerows.
Yeah, I don't think there needs to be a conflict here, although I'm sure some of the other panelists will experience what I have, which is that supply chains tend to focus on one thing or the other. You know, they either want you to have more wildlife or they want you to be locking up carbon. Actually, what we want our supply chains to do is to ask us to do both. And I think, you know, there is a great deal of compatibility here. I'll start with the hedgerows because that's the bit I've spent most work on. Well, no surprises to you that a well-managed hedge, which is of a good size, will produce more berries and more fruit and more nesting sites and be better for wildlife and biodiversity. And guess what? It locks up more carbon at the same time. And the same applies to the soil, and we've got really good data on this. When we moved away from ploughing to direct drilling, our earthworm numbers went from 200 per square metre to 700 per square metre. And that's because the carbon in the soil increases, particularly at the surface, which is the important place for it to be. And that is providing food for all the soil invertebrates. And they themselves then provide food up the food chain to the farmland birds. So the more carbon you lock into the soil, the healthier your soil will be, the more resilient it will be against climate change, but the more wildlife it will support at the same time.
Brilliant, thank you. Second question, I suppose, is if you're a farmer, what would be probably the most important SFI action that you would pick up on to help you along your carbon journey? Is it a soil management plan or what? I'm sorry to throw it at you, but it's quite a complex one for 2 seconds.
No, not at all. Well, I farmed organically before I took over the Allerton project. And what I particularly like about the organic system is that the rotation consists of 2 phases. One phase is what we call the restorative phase, when you build up the soil fertility, and then the other phase is the exploitative phase, when you harvest that fertility. In purely arable systems, we don't do that. We use nitrogen fertilizer to build the fertility, and we don't have that restorative period. So for me, the best SFI option available is the legume lays, where I get paid to put a whole field into a legume fallow. Obviously, that is good for insects, but really what I'm interested in it is the carbon that's putting back into the soil and the nitrogen fixing as well. And this is really helpful as well in breaking the arable weed cycle, particularly dealing with herbicide-resistant blackgrass.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Alistair. I'm going to move on to Claire Mike, if I may. And Claire, I suppose the question I have for you really is, since this whole thing of net zero kicked off a few years ago, what are the real changes that you've seen within Leaf, and what sort of areas have been weakest, I suppose, and what sort of areas have been strongest in the SAQs that you see back? Sorry, mouthful of a question, sorry.
No, that is a great question. I think because a lot of the solutions to reducing your emissions have existed within that integrated farm management approach ever since it was kind of designed. I think it's been really simple to understand how we can support farmers and growers on that journey to net zero through that integrated farm approach. I think some of the challenges have perhaps come in terms of understanding the tools that can be used, supporting farmers and growers to know what to do with those answers that they get from the tools, for example. I suppose some of it comes also from multiple different requests and expectations. You know, farmers often don't have a single customer. They might have 1, 2, 3 different customers. And actually, if the ask is not consistent, then that can be quite challenging too. I think, and I have seen over the last year or so, that there is a greater alignment and consistency within supply chains, or also a recognition of not necessarily being too prescriptive. So I think we're really encouraged that actually where the starting to measure emissions is important for different customers and different stakeholders, actually there is flexibility allowed. I think in terms of the tools, yes, we know that the tools, there's still a lot of work to be done there. There is that work towards harmonisation already, but actually we need to do more there. But our role at Leaf, really, the way that we've recognised it, has always been supporting farmers and growers to get on the journey. So to pick a tool that seems that it might work, to use it for a year or so, ensure that it's, you know, that you become comfortable and that you can use it properly, and then continue to use that tool. So okay, your reading might not be accurate or it might not be perfect yet, but actually, number one, you're learning how to use a tool, you're learning how to measure and monitor and to think about your business in that way. And secondly, at least what you can get an idea of is improvement or otherwise. So that's kind of where we've seen our role over the last couple of years. We do that in consultation and through the brilliant network of demonstration farmers that we work with. So they're sharing their story through events, webinars, networks, case studies, etc. So again, it's about how we take the learnings that we can get at Leaf through the research, the projects, the network, and how we help the industry scale that up. I think a couple of the projects that we've been working on as well have been particularly pertinent to that. So the co-op Journey to Net Zero project that we've been working on for the last couple of years, and also the new Waitrose Farming for Nature as well. So yeah, I think it's about collaboration, working together to support the industry.
Okay. Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move on to Beth Metzen now and the Soil Association Exchange, if I may. This SAX has basically conducted a survey over 294,000 hectares of farmland. How does the SAX, you know, how can we use that best to help farmers with their net zero journey? And if there was one thing that you'd say, what would be the one thing, if you only had one choice, what would be the one thing you'd tell farmers to do?
Oh, blimey. Okay.
Sorry.
So yes, we've actually written a report as well, which is, you know, you can access that on our website around the data insights that we've got from that survey. So by all means, have a look at that, because that's it's quite an easy read. We found that there's a huge complexity, and I don't suppose anyone's going to be surprised by that. And there tends to be quite a few unintended consequences when you do focus on single things. So I think one of the key messages is make sure you're looking at, you know, really wide in terms of what the impacts are of your focus areas. I think the thing we really pride ourselves on is this element of collecting data but utilizing it. So actually look at it, and that's been mentioned by a couple of the speakers already today, is that we do collect a lot of data, and actually the important bit is actually putting that into some sort of action plan, some sort of strategy that you can get excited about. And I think sometimes the net zero conversation doesn't always excite people, whereas I think if you talk more about risk and self-sufficiency and bringing in an element of self-sufficiency, I think is, especially with the climate changes we're having at the moment, both market-wise but also weather situations that we're experiencing as well, I think that tends to be better and it lands better, and it feels like, you know, you're looking after, you know, your own, and you've got that ownership over it, a bit like what David was saying before. So I think that was a really big output from Exchange, in terms of that's some of the learnings we definitely heard, is that actually getting excited about net zero can be difficult, but actually if we try and think about it more about risk and efficiencies and the benefits, you know, and a bit like Trina was saying, you know, it's actually like an output, a co-benefit is net zero, but actually focusing more on soil health will massively influence your productivity, and that feels easier to focus on. And this element of benchmarking, again, I heard one of the speakers mention as well, is something that we've brought a new focus on in Exchange, so that farmers used to be able to just see a score out of 30 on Exchange, and now they can see how they compare to others who are similar to them, whether that be soil type or enterprise. Again, that's really helping farmers to see like the art of the possible, and I think that's quite powerful as well.
Yeah. The second question I have for you, just quickly, is if farmers want to use the exchange, is it free or do they have to pay for it? How does it happen?
Yeah, so there's a couple of options. So a lot of the farmers that have been through exchange have been sponsored by somebody in their supply chain. So we call them sort of our corporate partners. So we've got a list of those again on our website who have sponsored farmers to go through exchange. There is a farmer-led approach that you can take as well by paying for yourself. We send out, I call them technicians, who go and actually measure primary data on the farm, like I've mentioned already. And also we really would urge farmers to take one-to-one advice. So that's something that we provide as well, is element of, it's fine having all this data again, but actually let's make sure we're putting a plan against that rather than just collecting it and putting it on the shelf. Let's make sure we utilize that with advice. So yeah, it can be farmer paid for, or it can be sponsored as well through the supply chain.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, thank you, Beth. I'm going to move quickly on to James. James, if I could ask, what's your crystal ball telling you? How is finance looking for agriculture in the next 10 to 30 years? And, you know, how green will farmers have to be to get a loan?
Two very good questions, and probably two answers needed that will take quite a bit of time. But I guess from what we're seeing within Barclays, if I take the second part of the question first, we understand that every one of our customers is on a different part of that journey. So the last thing that we want to do is stop providing finance to farmers because they're not at a certain point of that sustainability journey. That is the last thing we want to do, because it will stop the investment, stop the growth, and clearly cause a lot of cash flow issues. But there's an inevitability that as we move forward over the years, we will need customers, regardless of sector, to be moving towards a more sustainable position. So a load of the comments that have been made today, I really echo, and actually we need to start somewhere. So at the moment, if you're a Barclays customer, you'll come to us. It might be cash flow support is way as an overdraft or a term loan. We go to our agricultural credit team. They understand the nature of agriculture and how it's quite cyclical. It will go up and down depending on harvest, etc. It's a purely risk decision. As we move forward, the lens of sustainability and the climate risk will be layered on top of that. So are we lending to a customer, one who has shown affordability, but also are they moving towards that sustainability goal that we've got as a sector? Now, the only parts of the sector we're seeing at the moment, because of the dairy and livestock is the largest emitters within that sector, we do ask a couple of extra questions at the moment when we're lending them money. And again, it's not to trip them up or to say, no, we're not lending. It's more a case so that we can help with our sort of shareholder report to say, look, we have got X amount of dairy and livestock customers. This is how they're sort of tracking in terms of how many are doing measurements, baselining, etc. Now, what I would say, my team is here over more in the east. Majority of our customers are arable based, but they are probably further back in the line in terms of their journey, because that supply chain for a dairy farmer and a livestock farmer, those questions have already come to the fore. So if you want a decent milk contract, there's a good chance that you will have to be showing the credentials of being quite green and doing a lot of proactive things around the sustainability, because that's part of somebody's scope 3. So those questions are already being asked on that part of the sector. Over in arable, there's not a great deal of questions being asked, because it's actually, we'll just grow it, it will sell to potentially a trader in the middle, and they'll sell it on as it always has been. So where is that sort of supply chain pressure or consumer pressure to make them change practice? And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, because at the moment with costs and everything, we just want to make some money, and that's what most farmers want to do. But there will be a time where that sort of scales up. So I guess to finish that second part of the question, I think there will be a time where we ask a few more questions, but it will be to help guide them, support them, signpost them with all the great people that are on the call today, there's lots of support out there, and we will unfortunately have some customers who bury their head in the sand, pop it up in 10 years time and think, oh blimey, what do I do? So the earlier we can engage with them and just understand it, the better. Now, I guess the first part of the question, the challenge we have within the sector is around that baselining. So what we can't understand is where everybody is in terms of that baseline. So you can't compare like for like, because how many livestock does a farmer have? How many acres? What machinery? We all know that that's the challenge, and that's why we haven't got a consistent framework of measuring emissions on farm. Yet that will come, and then we see a bit of collaboration in that space. But as a bank, that's really difficult for us. And then as a sector, what does that finance look like? Well, some of you may have heard the word blended finance. Now that is sort of taking traditional bank finance, but coupled with government support. So that might be in a way of a grant. It might be SFI. So you've got the finance coming in there, you've got the bank finance coming in there, and then what we're looking at for the third part is actually how can the supply chain also take some risk there. So the farmer, if you haven't got that security for the traditional bank finance, it can be really difficult. So then how do you invest in a greener future? So that's where we think, well, actually, if you're part of that, if you're let's take one of the large food processors, you're taking raw material commodity from the farmer. You want it grown regeneratively because that will help with your brand. It will help with your own emissions. Well, actually, you should be then supporting that farmer by giving them either some finance, some security, so that they can comfortably invest in the future. If we all collaborate together and put our arms around that farmer, then I think that's where we're going to get most traction. But it can't be just reliant on the bank. It can't just be reliant on the government. And we need all parties to be coming to the table to help. And that's where we get that blended finance from. So the risk is sort of diluted, but we've got a real good offering so that actually if I'm a customer, I can invest in tech for the next 10 years rather than thinking, well, how am I going to afford to pay it back because who knows what the weather's doing or where's the cost of X, Y, and Z. So we need to have that comfort. And I think that's quite an exciting thing for us to explore. We're talking to a lot of large food producers because actually we've got the funds to help, but we as a highly regulated bank, clearly we've got to prove our position that it's affordable, we've got the security, and that's not always the case. But if we can get other parties to the table, how can that sort of be given out, which I think is quite an exciting time for the sector.
Okay, I'll move on. Thank you for that, James. I'm going to move on to Trina quickly, if I may. Trina, with your background in finance, I'm interested to get your take on this whole thing of net zero in farming and where it's going. How do you see it? As somebody who's come from a financial sector into farming, you probably see it a slightly different way to the rest of us. And I'm just interested on your take of where you're going, knowing what you're doing on soils, etc.
I think picking up on what some of the other panelists have said as well, it's part of the future. So we need to be credible businesses. We need to be taking this subject seriously because everyone else in the supply chain around us will be. And if we don't, we'll get left behind. So from a financial stability point of view, and as James was saying as well, it's going to be part of that conversation. We can't avoid it. It's absolutely got to be part of it. It's also coming from a lot of my time as well was spent within manufacturing. So it's about margin control. And the only way you can keep ahead of your margins is through innovation. And it's managing that and adopting those changes when it's suitable for your organization. And if you can be ahead of the game on it, then that's brilliant. But obviously there's a risk factor beside that. So for me, it's a must for the future security of any farming business, and trying to understand what elements of it are relevant, because every farm's different. there's no blanket approach to this. It's every farm is different. So it's understanding, and even within what we farm, we've got 3 different sites, and the journey that each of those sites take is different, because there'll be elements on how the water is managed, how the different types of soil. So you've got to be realistic about what's credible for you. But yeah, it's about margin control, taking advantage of technology as it's coming along, and ensuring that you're a credible business in that supply chain for the future.
Brilliant, thank you. I suppose the other thing too is, what challenges did you see when you started on this journey? Because, you know, relative to the other 2 farms, you're relatively newer in the journey, but what challenges did you find? And I'm going to put it in here as well. I know you're involved with women farmers, and how do you see the role of women in agriculture as part of this journey as well?
So start with the challenges. When we're coming into the industry, I think data for me is the biggest challenge. So I've come from very controlled environments, very controlled industries with very tight margins, where we understood our data and understood what was going on to the nth degree. In manufacturing, we were working on margins on 1.5%, and so there's no room for error there. And I think that's what I found really difficult, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, as our input costs have gone up dramatically, and we just don't have the same control over that as other industries do. So really understanding the data and having the systems around us, and the option for systems that will support us on that journey, I think has been the most worrying element for me. Data is, like I say, data is power to me. And then it's the speed of change within the industry. It's like some industries you feel like you're in a dinghy and you can spin around quickly and get on with it, but within farming, you're definitely in a massive oil tanker. It
doesn't change quickly.
No, it's a very slow process, and you've got to stick with it. You've got to look a long time down that road and accept that it's going to take time. And it's like the journey that we're doing with taking cover crops in, they're not giving us the results immediately that everybody has been talking about. So trying to encourage the team to go, it will happen. We need to stick with this. It will happen. There's evidence to support it. We just need to give it time. We need to give it time down that road. So I think those have been the challenges. The biggest one. I mean, there's lots of other ones around water and water management, and the climate changes that are coming, but again, that's part of a longer term strategy. In terms of women being part of the journey, I think it's we've got a slightly different take on things. I think naturally we're more nurturing and probably more patient, so we tend to be prepared to just see things further down the line and think about the next generation in a more comfortable way that doesn't challenge our competitiveness or necessarily our ability to get the results here and now. But that's a big generalization. We all come at it from different angles, but I think it's the more diverse any team is, the more diverse any industry is, the more value we get out of all those people bringing different things to the table, whether that's men or women. I don't think that matters. It's diversity that's important.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll move on quickly because I'm conscious of time. Thank you, Trina. I'll come on to Andrew. I'm very interested, Andrew, to hear you've talked briefly about it when you introduced yourself. Let's talk more about your journey into regenerative agriculture, and really a bit more about what you've learned from it. What are some of the challenges that you faced? And especially when you did it, because so few people, I guess, would have been down that route at the time. It was quite a leap of faith, I guess.
Yes. So quite often in these books, it talks about how the regenerative movement's been led from the bottom upwards. So essentially, we're talking about a little bit like organic, cutting out quite a lot of the inputs, whether it be fertilizers, agrochemicals, seed dressings, and therefore no agrochemical company, big industry is going to support that, because they want to take a cut, and we want to actually take that cut and put it back in our pockets. So as they've experienced in America, there's no help for the farmers, but also quite a lot of the researchers are backed by the big agricultural companies, and so therefore there's no research being done in any of the agricultural colleges or universities. So to some degree, it's very frustrating that we're having to learn everything from either an experience of an American with a slightly different climate, or by our own mistakes. And joining something like BASE or going to Groundswell can help accelerate the learning curve where you don't go through mistakes. But it was a leap of faith, and I just had to do it. But I think the other thing I tried to do, I mean, we're all guilty of probably historically growing a simple rotation with wheat and oilseed rape, maybe with a bit of barley thrown in. So I was ambitious to create diversity within my rotation and grow something that somebody wanted to eat, or it would help. So I tried quinoa, I tried lupins, I've actually tried one called meadowfoam, but in each of those instances I was probably up against climate change, where we got hot, dry summers, and I managed to lose money on all those products. So it's been a pretty steep learning curve, because a year is a long time to realise that you've made a mistake, or you're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Yeah.
And then the other thing I'm interested in, you talked about the Environmental Farmers Group. Tell us a bit more, and how can it help? You know, we've got a lot of small farmers in the county, and for sure they're looking at what they can do. They can't compete with the big guys in the veg sector. So is there opportunities, do you think, through the environmental route for the small farmer?
Yeah, so the group in Hampshire was set up to sort of trade natural capital, and they're working closely with the government, but they will probably charge 3% of a trade for administration, and then the theory is that the cooperatively minded, and 9% of the trade will be shared between the other farmers in the group, which is probably quite a good concept, but I think it maybe needs refining, and we've come up against that. But fundamentally, if I was quite sure that I wouldn't need carbon in my supply chain agreement, I could go out into the market now and start to gain an income stream from carbon credits. And so I'm about halfway up the soil organic matter list. I've come from, say, sub 2% in soil organic matter to about 3.6 plus. And I've gained about 0.2% of organic matter a year. So it can be done. But this could become either a tradable product with a standalone company, or companies like Wild Farmed are looking at whether they can make it an added benefit to the people they supply, the supermarkets, the flour millers, and actually pay us directly as a premium on our wheat, on top of the premium that we may get for a regen product.
Yeah. Okay. I suppose the next question is, where are you, do you think, on your net zero journey?
Right. So I've done 3 carbon calculators. I'm pretty confident I am net zero.
Yeah.
So it's what to do with it, isn't it? It's whether you've got to use it as a condition of supply, or once again, is it something you can look at trading?
Yeah.
I did think about a pretty straightforward system of reward whereby if you had a carbon calculator where you got scored in a gold, silver and bronze, gold being net zero and bronze being just started on the route, and then you were rewarded by say 5% of your product sale for bronze and 15% for gold, that would encourage the whole supply chain to pretty rapidly get to net zero and reward them accordingly. But I haven't found anybody to embrace this concept.
Not yet. It's coming. It's coming. Okay. Conscious of time. Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to move on to John now. And really, I suppose, John, my first question is going back to 1998. You must have faced some real challenges when you converted from your dairy farm, I guess, conventional to organic. And I suppose there wasn't an awful lot of help. How did you do it? So for people who are on their net zero journey and they're looking to take steps to, if you like, cut down on fuel, cut down on inputs, try and get the carbon down, what would you say to them?
I think realistically, the point at which we were forced to make that decision to go organic, we were running out of other options. So I think that generally, talking to other farmers, it is a position. While it's all about risk management, and while things are sort of just bumbling along, you tend to not want to make too many serious changes, because quite often in farming there isn't a lot of water under the keel, and one false move and it could probably end the business. We were at a point in 1998 whereas if we didn't do anything we were going to be going under. The dairy was losing money at quite a rate at that point in conventional terms. So for us, we had to take the risk. We had to do a change, and it forced us to go out and try and find that support. And the difficulty for us was, particularly where we are in Lincolnshire, there were very few other livestock-based mixed farms around to go and try and get ourselves on that journey quickly. So we did a lot of touring around the country at the point. We got in the car and we tried to find people who were at a similar point in that journey and used ourselves as a sponge and tried to absorb as much information as we could from their experience as possible. And I think that would be, I think if I was to give some advice to people, embracing change isn't something we should be frightened of. Go out, just even if it spends a day here or a day there to go and talk to somebody. You don't actually have to come home and make a change tomorrow on your farm, but it's all those little bits of information that you can draw together, and there will come a point where you think, actually, this is something we can do. There's an opportunity here in the market, and all those different pieces of your business will align sufficiently for it to be the next obvious choice. But you need the information there. You need all those supports, and I would like to sort of feel that it's like building a bank, if you like, a little bit of a reservoir there of knowledge, and you've got all those tools there to draw upon when that point of change comes along.
Okay, very interested. You work a lot with population dynamics in your crops. Just talk us a little bit through that. How does it work, and what are the challenges? Because obviously you have a dynamic population in the field. When you go to sell the product, do you come up against resistance? Because it's not one variety X or Y, it's several varieties, and it may even be that there's beans or peas in with your cereals. How does it work, John? Sorry, what's the benefit?
Yeah. So this comes, I suppose, in the last probably 10 years or so, we've been just trying to build resilience into, our model of farming. I'm sure all farmers will say it's the unpredictability of weather, and when we do get weather patterns, they tend to be extremes of weather patterns. and having crops particularly that can withstand that unpredictability comes very much the same about managing risk, and it's trying to spread your options a little bit on it. So in terms of the crops that we've been growing, instead of a single variety of wheat, let's say, we've been doing quite a bit of work in terms of populations and understanding how population wheats would work in farming. The problem for us is we are very much focused on growing milling wheat. And for the commodity markets, if we were selling a milling wheat, they need a specific type of variety putting on the passport when it's sold. Mm-hmm. The mill at the other end needs to know what they're buying in. So when we go to them and say, actually, the population that we've been growing is 180 different varieties, which is what YQ was, that sort of sends them in a bit of a tailspin. We've been quite fortunate that we've dealt predominantly with our milling directly with a mill, Tuxford Mill and other mills, and we're able to explain to them what it is we're growing and bring them on the journey with us. So we have a market that is aligned to what we're trying to do as a farmer. And I think it was Andrew who mentioned Wild Farm. They are working on sort of multi-species. I think their mixes are actually quite a lot simpler, but in principle, I think there's a general recognition that having diversity within crops is a considerable strength. For us in an organic world where we're trying, obviously we have no insecticides and no fungicides, having that diversity, genetic diversity within a crop means that if you've got let's say a particular variety that's susceptible to rust, it's not going to go through the whole field and take the whole field out with rust. You've got complementary strengths within that population which limits the spread of any disease, and that's got, I think, a relevance to all sorts of farming. It's not just organic farming, it's anybody who's trying to reduce an application of fungicide and all the associated costs that go with fungicide. So I'm hoping that actually over time we will find that the milling industry becomes a lot more open to this as a solution and understands that provided they know what they're buying in terms of the protein and how that will perform in their milling operation, they'll be able to use it. And as you know, I've had chats with some of the mainstream millers and said, well, actually, we're blending anyway. Just as long as we know what we're getting in, we can still blend. Yeah. So quite often, so many solutions are about communication and understanding within the supply chain where these solutions are and what each of the responsibilities of those within supply chain are, just to make a solution work.
Brilliant. Now, I'm conscious of time, but I've got one last question for you, and we'll have to keep it short because I think we'll have to take some questions from the attendees. But what's your organic matter in your soil, and what sort of level of carbon have you hit in the soil?
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting one. And I mean, we're at about, let's say, the organic matter content is probably about 8% at the moment. We're on some heavy clay soils, we've got alluvial soils, we've got all sorts. And it was interesting, both Trina and Andrew saying about this being a very long-term thing. Back in the 1990s, we were on about 2%, 3%, something like that. And in the early days, it didn't matter what we do. It was incredibly slow, the building of the organic matter. But once you got the life in the soil going, it really did start to take off. There were some soils, the alluvial soils, we know are much harder at building organic matter content, and we're not going to lose a lot of sleep over the fact that they're a bit more stubborn. But we're also conscious about the amount of carbon, the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soils, managing those and what those numbers mean. We're making sure we're not just chasing numbers, we are understanding what's actually happening in the soil. On paper, something like our carbon to nitrogen ratio may not be ideal. We're not hitting this 12 to 20 sweet spot, but all the soils are working really well at a 10 to 1 ratio. So there's a point where you've got to just know what works well for your farm.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'm going to come back to Alex now and just see if there's any questions in the chat box.
Not had anything through so far. I think everyone's covered everything in a lot of detail. But I know we've got some questions that were submitted before that you've got on your side, Paul. So if anyone else wants to add anything into the Q&A, please do. But if not, probably go back to those questions, Paul.
Okay. Right. Just bear with me. I think I'll come back to James, if I may. I just want to ask him a little bit about what Barclays are doing in terms of, just bear with me 1 second, the agri-carbon and the Sustainable Markets Initiative, if you could.
So the agri-carbon is sort of an early stage potential partnership, really, just where we can try to work with Agri-Carbon to understand, is there a position for them to support our customers who haven't already taken the done a carbon measurement, for example. What we don't want to do, because clearly with a bank we ask a lot of questions already, whether it be identification, KYC, all of the horrible things that we have to do as a bank. The last thing we want to do is say you've got to do X, Y, and Z. So we're really trying to simplify everything. So we're looking at exploring this partnership to see if there's anything we can do there to support our customers, and also support us in terms of how we measure the sector. And then the other part is probably what I've already mentioned, really, is just that sustainable initiative is where we're working with other sort of partners to see how we can work collaboratively for the support of our customer base. So is there data that we've already got that we can share, that we can, obviously having Barclaycard as part of the group, there's a lot of data that's drawn from there. So is there data that we can take from there to help our customer base to understand their business a bit more, to understand, so for example, can we draw off high energy users? So we can look at direct debits of our customers, and we've got some customers who are paying a lot for energy. And then we can have a conversation with them about actually how do you minimize energy spend, or can you look at renewables? So it's just being clever with the data that we've got, but with the end goal of really trying to help our customer base, because if we can help our customers reduce emissions over time, then that's going to have a clearly a positive impact for us and widely the biodiversity and everything else that comes with it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, James. I've got a question for Beth now. As a farmer, Beth, what changes have you seen, due to this net zero thing? And do you think the sector is generally doing enough to reach 2050 and net zero by 2050, given it's only about 26 years away?
Yeah, I'm going to be another one that mentions wild farmed here, but yeah, we also grow for wild farmed at home. Our focus really has been about reducing our expense in farming and our risk of things we can't control. So that's why we looked at other markets, and I'm really encouraged to hear others mention the same thing, whether that be organic markets or the Green Farm Collective, but finding funding sources that can fund the way you want to farm and your end goal. And I think that's another thing around SFI is AB 15's been mentioned, and I think it's a really good option. It's something we utilize. Actually, we utilize the grazing option rather than that one, because we've got we integrated livestock into the farm about 10 years ago to build that fertility and to again reduce our reliance on bought in anything, essentially, and that's made us feel a lot more comfortable in the last few years. When we have seen hikes in prices, it has meant that we can have a little bit more peace of mind, which is a huge value to us at home, and I think that's been a big win for us. But it comes with risk. So we really struggled to hit some of the proteins for wild farmed last year, and that was a massive risk for us. And that came with some financial difficulty, which I think you've got to be prepared for. And that comes back to this element of don't put all your eggs in one basket. utilize funding to make sure that you're aligned with what your future goals are. Don't just think, oh, that looks great on paper, that AB15 or that GS4. Those mixes that you can get funding for in the old countryside stewardship and now in SFI as well. But think about what it's actually giving me and on the farm's goals, and actually really think, does that utilize that funding in a way that's going to look after my farm in the long term and achieve all these different goals I've got for the farm? What was I going to say? What was the other question? Oh, industry wise, I think the short answer is no. We're probably not doing enough as an industry. There's a lot more we can do, but I think individually we've got some fantastic farmers on the call, and it's always nice to have a bit of validation that you think similar to others. I always think it's really nice to hear that, and I think there's some really nice alignment there. But I think the messages are really clear as well throughout the whole panel around, which I always think is good as well for those who are listening in. There's some really key messages around, building efficiencies and considering diversity and utilizing data and all these sorts of things. There's some really key messages that are coming out from everybody that's speaking today, some real areas of focus. So yes, I think there's more we can do in terms of baselining and measuring. And I thought that's really impressive that John's got some ideas about what his organic matter was in the 90s. I thought, wow, that's like a really powerful message that you've got that data backing up what you're doing and you're using that to feedback. It's a feedback loop in terms of, yes, I'm doing the right thing for what I want to achieve. And I think that's really powerful. And I think that should encourage others to make a start. And again, I've heard on the call about starting small, trialing stuff. That's how we started at home, is just start trialing different ways of growing things and see the benefits. So again, like I mentioned about the wild farm side of things, we didn't hit the protein, but you should have seen the difference with the disease in our wild farmed crop compared to our conventional crop. Like, it was incredible. That diversity we brought in with those wild farmed fields did give us some pleasure that we weren't using as much fungicide and in our wild farmed, and actually it seemed that that was massively working in terms of the diversity we're bringing into those fields compared to those conventional monocrops.
Okay, I think Alistair's got his hand up for a question.
Well, I was just going to make a point there, actually, which is that if you want to go away from an all arable system and bring livestock back in, that is a massive step. You're going to have to fence your fields, put water in. You're probably going to need some buildings. You might need a stockman. He might need a house. You've got a whole load of admin to deal with, because you're now going to have to deal with NVZ regulations and veterinary medicine and animal welfare and so on. So if you want to start out and just give it a go into an AB15 legume lay, buy yourself a mower and cut and mulch it. And, see how you get on with that. And if you find, well, actually, this is working very well, you see the advantages in the arable part of the rotation, and then you think, well, actually, there's no doubt that, manure is really good for the soil. It's also good for insects and biodiversity on the farm. If you want to then, or maybe you'll get a neighbour to come in and graze it or something like that, but do things a step at a time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, folks, I'm going to have to be a bit naughty and call it halt. I just want to thank everybody of the panel and everybody for attending. I'm really grateful for your time today. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. I hope people have learned a lot. I think the message is very clear. Data is key. I think what we've got to do as a farming organisation and sector, if you like, is to get as much data as we can, keep it simple, focus on scope 1 and 2, which is the data around what you do and what energy you do. It's to get the scope 3 data from your suppliers, which is their scope 1 and 2. It's to have a plan, and it's to work to that plan. And remember that everything you do as a farmer is potentially something that is going to help you on that journey towards net zero. As we've seen from Andrew and John, they've got to net zero in different timescales. It does depend on your farming method and what you're doing, but the message is still that we can make a change. What I will say is we are facing into probably 3 to 4 degrees of climate change rather than the 1.5 that the COP organisations wanted to try and achieve, but there is still time to make the change. So thank you to everybody for your inputs, and if any of the attendees would like to know more from any of the people, just let us know, and we can for sure try and put you in touch. Okay, so thank you for your time.